So, I just moved into what I thought was a quiet, peaceful neighborhood. Then I met Karen. She tried to control everyone with her fake HOA rules and a wannabe cop. Too bad she didn't realize my wife is an FBI agent who doesn't take crap from anyone. What happened next? Let's just say she picked the wrong house to mess with. Before we dive in, let me know where you're watching from today. When we first rolled our rickety moving truck down this quiet, tree-shaded street, I couldn't help but think we'd finally found the sweet spot where lemonade stands and friendly porch waves were just part of the landscape. The soft hum of the engine blended with the lazy rustle of leaves, like the whole place was exhaling a warm, peaceful breath to welcome us. My wife, Sarah, was grinning at the neat little houses, each one sporting flower beds that looked like they'd been plucked from a magazine. "This is it," she whispered, beaming at me like we just discovered a hidden gem. I pictured us grilling in the backyard, swapping tips on lawn care with neighbors, and maybe even organizing a block party someday. For the first time in a while, I felt like we'd actually found a place to breathe easy. Just as I was hoisting a particularly heavy box from the truck, I caught a flicker of movement out of the corner of my eye, a sharp, purposeful clip of heels cutting through the calm. Turning around, I spotted her, a woman with a stiff posture marching toward us like a drill sergeant about to do a uniform inspection. She had a thick binder clutched to her chest, papers sticking out at odd angles, and her gaze zeroed in on our truck like it was some kind of personal offense. "You're blocking the sidewalk," she barked like she was reading off a police report. Sarah and I shared a quick, confused look before offering an awkward apology. "We'll move it as soon as we're done unloading," I said, trying to sound polite. The woman didn't budge. "It needs to be moved now," she snapped, like a parking ticket come to life. She introduced herself as Karen in a way that made it sound like she was demanding we memorize the name for future reference. "I'm responsible for maintaining community standards," she informed us, like she was delivering some kind of royal decree. "For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." I tried to keep my face neutral, but the way she wielded that binder like a weapon made my stomach tighten. I'd heard of neighborhoods with strict HOAs, but this was feeling more like moving into a boot camp. I nodded along as she rattled off a list of guidelines that seemed to include everything from garbage bin etiquette to the precise shade of beige allowed on door trims. I wasn't sure whether to laugh or feel genuinely threatened as she finally huffed and stormed off, binder bouncing against her hip. I couldn't help but wonder just how many people on this block had been bulldozed into submission by her little clipboard crusade. The next morning, I woke up to find a neon pink flyer taped to our porch railing, covered in meticulous typewritten rules about lawn heights, trash bin schedules, and even the types of garden gnomes considered appropriate. Sarah squinted at it in incredulous disbelief. "Does this woman not have hobbies?" she muttered. At the bottom, it bore the emblem of the so-called Neighborhood Oversight Council, which felt suspiciously like something Karen had made on her home printer. I couldn't help but laugh at how official it looked, but the humor faded when I realized how many violations we'd already racked up just by existing. Later that day, I crossed paths with Brian, a neighbor walking his beagle. I casually mentioned the flyer, and he gave me a look like I just joined a secret society of the harassed. "Karen's been running this neighborhood like it's her private kingdom for years," he whispered. "She fines people for the dumbest stuff and acts like she's got the law on her side. Most folks just pay up to avoid the hassle." My stomach sank. Does she actually have the authority to do any of this? I asked. Brian hesitated. That's the thing, nobody's really sure. But once she got that security guy involved, people stopped questioning it. That was news to me. Security guy. I promise you, Ed, Brian nodded, glancing over his shoulder like he half expected to see someone lurking. Yeah, some self-proclaimed officer Karen hired. No one knows who he really is, but he likes to throw his weight around. I could feel my pulse quicken. An unofficial cop with a badge and a chip on his shoulder sounded like a disaster waiting to happen. I thanked Brian and walked back to the house, trying to make sense of what felt like a suburban dictatorship wrapped in petunias and picket fences. Later that evening, we decided to push the tension aside and invited a few friends over for a casual barbecue, hoping the warm air and laughter would clear out the weird vibes. We set up the grill, draped some string lights, and let the smell of burgers fill the backyard. For a while, it actually worked. Conversations flowed, jokes bounced around, and I almost forgot about Karen, almost. Then, mid-story, I heard a sharp crack from near the fence line. I turned just in time to catch a flicker of movement, a shadow slipping out of sight. My heart jumped, and I glanced at my wife, who gave me a worried look. "Did you see that?" I whispered. She nodded, gripping my arm. We tried to brush it off as a stray cat or something, but when I walked over with a flashlight, I found fresh footprints in the grass leading right to the fence. That uneasy feeling clawed its way back, and suddenly the whole night felt tainted by paranoia. When I woke up the next morning, there was another note pinned to our gate, accusing us of hosting an unapproved social gathering and threatening fines for excessive noise. I couldn't help but laugh at the absurdity. Our little cookout wasn't exactly a rock concert. Sarah just sighed and tucked the note into our growing collection of Karen's craziness. "She's not going to stop," she said, her voice tight with frustration. "If she's willing to send her little security lapdog to spy on us, who knows how far she'll go." I felt a pang of guilt, realizing I'd underestimated just how deep Karen's grip ran in this neighborhood. It wasn't just about rules and fines, it was about power, and we just landed squarely in her crosshairs. I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I spotted that same car from the other day parked a few houses down. Sleek, dark, and suspiciously out of place in our cozy little suburb, it sat there like a lurking predator. Sarah slid up beside me at the window, squinting through the morning glare. "That's him, isn't it?" she whispered. I nodded, my gut tightening. "Yep, same guy. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. Do you think he's trying to scare us?" Sarah didn't take her eyes off the car. "If that's his goal, he's doing a lousy job. Nothing scarier than a guy playing cop without a badge." I snorted, but the tension didn't leave my shoulders. Just then, the car door creaked open, and out stepped the man himself. Tall, stocky, wearing a uniform that looked like it had been ordered off a knockoff website. He glanced around with a faux authoritative air, clipboard in hand, then started his slow patrol down the sidewalk. Sarah had her phone out before I could even think to grab mine. "Keep it subtle," I muttered, though she gave me a look that clearly said she didn't need advice on surveillance. We both stayed glued to the window as the guy strutted past our driveway, eyes scanning like he was hunting for infractions. He scribbled something on his clipboard and made a show of checking the tires of a parked car, like he was some kind of tire detective. I bit back a laugh. What's he looking for? The illegal presence of rubber. Sarah grinned, but her eyes stayed sharp. No badge number, no name tag. He's trying to look official without risking getting called out. As he moved on to the next house, Sarah zoomed in and caught a blurry shot of his badge. It looked like something you'd win at a carnival. What kind of HOA needs a uniformed enforcer anyway? I muttered. The paranoid kind, she shot back. We watched him move on to Brian's house, where he paused to inspect the beagle's dog bowl left on the front step. The guy scribbled something else and moved on. I could practically hear Brian cursing under his breath from across the street. Sarah lowered her phone, eyes narrowed. We need to talk to Brian, she said, and I knew she was already planning the next step. I made my way over to Brian's place, where he was already leaning against his porch railing with his beagle at his feet, looking somewhere between angry and resigned. That guy came by again, I said. Brian snorted. Yeah, tried to tell me my dog was in violation of yard cleanliness standards or some garbage like that. Said it's a $50 fine. I raised an eyebrow. He actually gave you a ticket? Brian shook his head. Nah, just threatened it. Said if it happened again, he'd escalate it. Sarah joined us, still holding her phone. Did he leave any paperwork or show an ID? Brian rubbed his forehead. Nothing. Just flashed that cheap badge and gave me attitude. Sarah looked thoughtful. He's trying to scare you into paying without leaving a paper trail. That way, he keeps it under the radar. Brian shook his head in disbelief. Who the hell is this guy? Sarah gave him a sly smile. That's what we're going to find out. That evening, curiosity got the better of me, and I started digging through the pile of flyers and notes Karen had left us. Maybe there was something buried in that mess that could clue us in on who this guy was supposed to be. Sarah was tapping away on her laptop, trying to track down any record of a legitimate neighborhood security hire. Nothing, she finally said, frustration creeping into her voice. If he's licensed, it's under the world's worst alias. No registration, no permits, no nothing. I wasn't surprised, but it made my gut twist anyway. So, he's just a guy playing dress up, I said. Sarah nodded, determination flashing in her eyes. A guy Karen's paying to act like a cop. That's a whole new level of messed up. Just then, Brian texted me, he's back. Pacing around with a gun on his belt. I showed Sarah, and her face went. That changes things, she said. If he's openly carrying and not a real officer, he's breaking the law. She grabbed her camera, her whole demeanor shifting from annoyed to laser-focused. We hurried down the street, staying in the shadows to get a good view without being seen. Sure enough, there he was, standing by the corner, hand casually resting on the grip of his pistol like he was just daring someone to ask him about it. My wife snapped pictures from a distance, her face a mask of concentration. I couldn't help but mutter, this guy's got a serious hero complex. As if on cue, Karen stepped out of her house, waving him over. They spoke in hushed tones, but my wife managed to capture a shot of Karen handing him a thick envelope. You think that's cash? I whispered. She gave a tiny nod. Either that or fake citations. Either way, it's proof she's paying him. My pulse quickened. We had enough footage to make a case, but I knew Sarah wasn't done yet. She wanted to push them to break, Force Karen to admit she was behind it all. "We need one more push," she whispered, snapping a final photo as the fake cop walked back to his car. The next morning, we got our chance. A loud knock at the door made me jump, and when I opened it, there he was, fake cop in full intimidating mode. "Got a complaint about unauthorized surveillance," he grunted. I fought back a smirk. "You mean the video of you carrying a firearm without a license? That's surveillance." His expression faltered for just a second, but then he scowled. "I'm doing my job, keeping this place safe." Sarah joined me at the door, phone in hand. "Your job? You mean pretending to be law enforcement? Pretty sure that's illegal. Would you like to explain yourself on camera?" He stiffened, suddenly realizing how exposed he was. I don't answer to you," he growled, but his bravado was cracking. Before I could respond, Karen appeared behind him, her face red and furious. "You two are out of line," she shouted. "You're harassing my security personnel." Sarah just smiled. "Funny, real security personnel have credentials. You want to explain why your guy doesn't?" Karen's face paled, and the fake cop looked ready to bolt. It was like watching a house of cards sway in the wind as Karen stammered, trying to regain her footing. I couldn't help but grin. "It's over, Karen," I said. "Everyone's catching on to your scam. You can't keep this up much longer." Karen sputtered, grasping for a retort that never came. I glanced at Sarah, who gave a satisfied nod. We'd pushed them into a corner, and it was only a matter of time before their little power trip collapsed entirely. After the fake cop's meltdown on our porch, news traveled fast. I could practically feel the whole neighborhood buzzing like a kicked hornet's nest. Brian called me that afternoon, his voice practically vibrating with excitement. "You guys are legends," he said, words getting around that Karen's whole empire is about to fall. "For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much." I couldn't help but laugh. "Maybe, but she's not going to go down without a fight," I replied. Sarah, still reveling in the victory of shaking Karen's little dictatorship, shot me a look. "Oh, she's definitely fighting," she said, scrolling through her phone. "Cindy from down the street just texted me. Karen's already going door to door, spinning some sob story about how we're ruining the community and stirring up trouble." I snorted. "Of course, she is. That woman would rather walk barefoot on hot coals than admit she's wrong." Sarah gave a small, wicked smile. "Let her try. The more she talks, the more she digs her own grave." I half expected Karen to show up at our doorstep again, but instead, we got a glossy new flyer taped to our door the next morning. It announced an emergency community meeting to discuss security concerns and neighborhood preservation. Sarah read it aloud, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "Preservation of what?" Karen's inflated ego. I chuckled and took the flyer from her. "She's rallying her dwindling troops, trying to salvage her little kingdom." Sarah nodded. "We have to go. If we don't show up, she'll spin it like we're hiding something." I agreed, even though the thought of sitting through her self-righteous tirade made my stomach twist. We spent the day preparing, gathering all the evidence we'd collected, photos, videos, witness statements. Sarah was in full-on investigative mode, sorting everything into neat files. "We're going to make this public," she said, her eyes sharp. If she's planning to stir people up, we'll give them the truth. When we arrived at the community center that evening, it was packed, standing room only. Neighbors lined the walls, some whispering, others looking tense. Karen stood at the front, gripping her binder like a lifeline. She forced a brittle smile when she saw us walk in. I leaned over to Sarah. She looks like she's about to deliver a eulogy for her own reputation. In a lot of confusion lately regarding neighborhood security and community standards. I want to assure you that all measures taken have been legal and necessary. I almost snorted out loud. Legal and necessary. I muttered. That guy couldn't spell legal if it was tattooed on his forehead. Karen pressed on, spinning a tale of crime waves, vandalism, and how her so-called security officer had just been trying to protect everyone. Unfortunately, she said, voice tinged with fake remorse, his efforts were misunderstood. Some residents have unfairly accused him of misconduct. That was my cue. I raised my hand. Karen, I called out, making sure my voice carried, if he was just a security consultant, why was he openly carrying a firearm without a license? And why did he threaten people with fines? Karen froze, and for just a second, her carefully curated mask slipped. The weapon was, an unfortunate oversight, she stammered. He was authorized to carry for his own protection. Sarah cut in. By whom? Because there's no record of his licensing anywhere in the state. The murmurs grew louder, and Karen's face turned red. Trying to regain control, Karen huffed, these disruptions are part of a targeted campaign to undermine my efforts to keep this neighborhood safe. I stepped forward. Undermine? You mean exposing the fact that you've been collecting fake fines for years and using intimidation to keep people quiet? Gasps rippled through the room, and Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Before she could answer, Brian stepped forward, phone in hand. I did some digging, he announced, holding up his screen. Turns out, the HOA Karen's been running doesn't actually exist anymore. The last legitimate meeting was over a decade ago, and nobody voted her into power. He shot her a glare. She's just been taking advantage of everyone. Karen sputtered, trying to shout over him. That's not true. I was entrusted to maintain order when the previous council dissolved. Sarah raised an eyebrow. Who entrusted you? There's no record of any appointment or election. Karen's face went beet red, and she started flipping through her binder like it held the secrets to eternal life. I couldn't resist. Looking for proof that doesn't exist. I quipped. Brian took the opportunity to speak up. People, we've all been bullied by her for nonsense, threatened with fake citations. It's time to stop letting her control us. A chorus of agreements swept through the room, and I saw Karen's expression shift from angry to panicked. Just when I thought the momentum couldn't get any better, Mrs. Anderson spoke up from the back. She charged me $100 for planting tulips because they weren't the approved color. Another neighbor chimed in, I paid $200 for a driveway slope infraction. Never even got a receipt. The room erupted with stories, one after another, people sharing how Karen had exploited them with her phony fines and bogus rules. Karen tried to cut through the noise, shouting about ungrateful residents, but nobody was listening anymore. She looked helpless, like a dictator whose subjects finally realized they could just walk away. Sarah stepped forward, raising her voice just enough to quiet the crowd. If anyone wants to file a formal complaint, we have documentation ready. There's no reason to fear her anymore. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. Brian gave us a thumbs up, and neighbors started forming little huddles, discussing how they could finally take back control. Karen slunk out of the room, binder clutched to her chest like a lifeline. I watched her go, feeling a weird mix of satisfaction and pity. Part of me almost wanted to feel bad for her, almost. As soon as the door slammed behind her, the room seemed to brighten, like the tension had finally snapped. People started clapping, and a few even patted us on the back. I couldn't help but grin, realizing that Karen's reign of terror was officially crumbling, one truth at a time. We walked home feeling victorious, but I knew one thing for sure, Karen wasn't done yet. People like her never go down without a final, desperate move. Sarah squeezed my hand as we walked down the now peaceful street. "She'll try something," she murmured. "She's too proud to let it end here." I nodded, glancing back at the community center. Whatever Karen had left in her bag of tricks, we'd be ready for it. The next morning, I couldn't help but feel like we were living in the eye of the storm, quiet, but with a tension that made my skin itch. Sarah was already in full detective mode, hunched over her laptop with a determined glare. "I've been combing through more public records," she muttered, barely looking up as I handed her a cup of coffee. "Did you know there's not a single record of Karen ever holding any HOA title? No votes, no meeting minutes, just nothing." I let out a low whistle. "So, she's been faking the whole thing from the start." Sarah gave me a fierce nod. "Yep, and I think I found a way to blow it all open. We just need her to admit it." I raised an eyebrow. "How do we do that?" She gave me a sly smile. "We're going to make her feel cornered, push her to defend herself until she slips up before we could put our plan into motion." There was a loud banging on the door. I glanced at Sarah, and we both instantly knew who it was. I took a deep breath and swung the door open to find Karen standing there, eyes blazing and binder hugged so tight it looked ready to burst. Behind her, 2 of her most loyal cronies, Margaret and Rick, stood with crossed arms and sour faces. "We need to talk," Karen snapped, pushing past me into the living room without an invitation. Sarah calmly closed her laptop and folded her arms, giving Karen a look that could melt steel. "Sure, Karen, come on in. Make yourself at home." Karen barely registered the sarcasm. "You're spreading lies," she accused. "You're tearing this neighborhood apart with your ridiculous rumors." I forced myself to stay calm. "You mean exposing the fact that you've been running a fake HOA and charging people phony fines?" "Yeah, that does sound disruptive." Rick stepped forward, his bulldog-like face twisted in anger. "Karen kept this neighborhood in line for years. You think you can just waltz in and ruin it?" Sarah didn't miss a beat. "Kept it in line or kept it under her thumb? There's a difference." Margaret, always eager to back Karen up no matter how absurd the situation, piped up. "She's just trying to maintain order. If people would follow the rules, we wouldn't have these problems." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "Whose rules exactly?" "Because it sure isn't anything written or voted on. It's just Karen's whims disguised as regulations." Karen scoffed. "You're blowing this way out of proportion. Nobody else has had a problem with my enforcement until you showed up. That's because you've spent years intimidating everyone into silence," I snapped. You bullied them into paying fake fines and threatened them with your pretend cop. We have proof, Karen. Video footage, documents, testimonies. You're done. Karen's face went white, and for the first time, I saw the fear flash in her eyes. She tried to brush it off with a forced laugh. Laugh? You really think anyone will take your side over mine? She sneered. Sarah took out her phone, thumb hovering over the record button. Why don't we ask the real cops about that? Just as Karen opened her mouth to respond, we heard the sound of tires crunching on gravel. A police car pulled up, and out stepped Officer Price, the same cop who arrested the fake HOA officer. Karen's face went from pale to ghostly white. I almost felt sorry for her, almost. Officer Price walked up the driveway, tipping his hat as he approached. Got a call about a disturbance, he said, glancing between Karen and us. I nodded. Just clearing up some confusion, I said. Turns out Karen's been running a fake HOA for years and collecting fines. We've got the evidence right here. Karen's face contorted into a mix of anger and desperation. They're lying. She shrieked, pointing a shaking finger at us. They've been spreading rumors to destroy everything I've worked for. Officer Price glanced at her coolly. Ma'am, we've been receiving complaints about unauthorized enforcement and fraud. Mind if I take a look at your binder there? Karen clutched it tighter. This is private property. She snapped. Price didn't budge. Ma'am, if you're collecting fines or issuing citations, that makes it public business. You either hand it over voluntarily, or we'll get a warrant. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. Karen's bravado crumbled, and with a shaky hand, she slowly extended the binder. Officer Price flipped through it, eyebrows knitting tighter with each page. Fake citations, unregistered fines, threats of lien placements without legal backing. He looked up at Karen, his jaw clenched. This is a serious offense. You've been impersonating a legal authority and extorting money from residents. Karen's lips trembled. I was just keeping order. Nobody else would step up. The neighborhood was falling apart. Officer Price didn't look impressed. Ma'am, you're coming with me. We'll need to sort this out downtown. As they cuffed her, Karen started shouting, You're all ungrateful. I kept this place from falling into chaos. You'll regret this. You'll see. Margaret and Rick just stared, looking like someone had poured cold water over their righteous anger. Rick muttered something about just trying to help, but Margaret wasn't having it. You lied to us. She hissed at Karen as they led her to the patrol car. You made us your personal watchdogs for nothing. Karen just kept ranting as they drove away, her voice muffled by the closed windows. Once she was gone, the tension broke like a snapped cable, and neighbors started cautiously stepping out of their houses, whispering to each other like they'd just been released from prison. Brian came jogging up, out of breath but grinning ear to ear. Did that just happen? He asked. Sarah nodded, a satisfied smile on her face. Oh yeah, it happened. And now it's over. We looked around at the neighbors gathering, some hugging each other, others shaking their heads in disbelief. The air felt lighter, like the whole block had collectively exhaled for the first time in years. Anderson standing at the edge of the yard, wiping her eyes. I can't believe it, she said softly. I thought I'd be paying fines forever. Sarah gave her a reassuring smile. Not anymore. We're going to make sure everyone gets their money back and that nobody pulls a stunt like this again. I squeezed her hand, grateful for her fierce determination and her ability to see things through to the end. We'd reclaimed our peace, and it felt better than I could have imagined. That evening, we sat on our porch watching the sun dip below the rooftops. Sarah leaned her head on my shoulder, finally letting herself relax. "Do you think she'll ever try to come back?" I asked. Sarah shook her head. "Doubt it. After what just happened, she's lost all her power. Nobody will listen to her now." I nodded, content in the quiet, finally free of the tyranny that had plagued the neighborhood for so long. "We did good," I said. Sarah smiled. "Yeah, we did." The dust hadn't even settled from Karen's dramatic exit when the real cleanup began. News of her arrest spread faster than wildfire. The whole neighborhood seemed to pulse with new energy, an odd blend of disbelief and relief. Sarah and I spent most of the next day fielding texts and calls from neighbors, each one more stunned than the last. Brian stopped by to give us the lowdown. "She's being held for questioning," he said, practically vibrating with excitement. "Turns out she's been pulling this scam for years, collecting fines and threatening liens without a shred of real authority. The police are going through her house with a fine-tooth comb." I couldn't help but shake my head. "I bet they're finding enough fake documents to fill a warehouse." Sarah smirked. "Good. Maybe they'll find her guide on how to be a dictator in 3 easy steps." Just when I thought things couldn't get more chaotic, a police car pulled up to Karen's house and started hauling out boxes of paperwork, binders, and file folders, some labeled community compliance and others marked private accounts. A few neighbors gathered at the curb, murmuring in shock. One older lady I hadn't met before gave a bitter laugh. "That witch fined me $300 for having plastic flowers instead of real ones," she muttered. Another guy, visibly fuming, said Karen had threatened to call Child Protective Services on his family for letting his kids draw chalk art on the driveway. I realized just how deeply she'd embedded herself into people's lives, planting fear and resentment everywhere she went. "It's going to take a while to undo all this damage," Sarah whispered, watching the evidence pile up on the lawn. I nodded, feeling a mix of anger and triumph. By evening, it was clear Karen's little empire had crumbled. The police even posted a notice on her front door declaring the property under investigation. That didn't stop the neighbors from gathering in little groups, gossiping and trading stories about all the times Karen had bullied them into paying up or making changes they didn't want. Brian took it upon himself to rally people for a proper meeting, not one of Karen's fake ones, but a real community gathering to discuss how to move forward. Sarah and I offered our backyard as the meeting spot, and within an hour, half the neighborhood had shown up. People brought folding chairs, snacks, and even some beer, and for the first time, the mood felt almost festive. Brian took the makeshift stage, an overturned milk crate, and cleared his throat. "All right folks," he said, raising his hands to quiet the crowd. "We all know why we're here. Karen's reign of terror is over, but we need to figure out what happens next. We can't just go back to the way things were." Sarah spoke up from the back, projecting her voice like a pro. "First, we need to make sure everyone who paid fines gets their money back. The police are looking into the accounts Karen used, but we should start gathering evidence of who paid what." Heads nodded, and people started murmuring about checks and receipts. One guy pulled out a crumpled ticket Karen had left on his car windshield and waved it in the air. She fined me $100 for parking too far from the curb. How do I get that back? Sarah gave a reassuring nod. Hang on to that. We'll make copies and get them to the authorities. We'll set up a collection point for evidence, photocopies, screenshots, whatever you've got. We'll compile it all and make sure it's submitted properly. A woman near the front, who looked like she was about to cry, blurted out, I paid her $500 to settle a property dispute that never even existed. Another guy, tall and stocky, chimed in, I shelled out $200 for a fence height violation that wasn't even real. I couldn't help but feel a surge of pride for Sarah's calm, commanding presence. She was steering this mob away from outrage and toward action. A sudden noise made us all turn. Rick, one of Karen's lackeys, was standing at the gate, looking like he just crawled out from under a rock. His face was pale, and his shoulders slumped. I didn't know. He mumbled. I thought she was legit. She told me I was helping keep. Brian folded his arms and gave him a hard look. And you never questioned why the HOA president needed a private cop with a gun? Rick looked genuinely shaken. She said he was certified. I didn't. I didn't think to check. I just followed orders. A few people muttered under their breath, but Brian held up a hand to quiet them. All right, Rick, if you've got any paperwork or messages from her, bring them to us. We're putting together a file for the authorities. Rick nodded, grateful not to be immediately shunned, and shuffled back toward his house. As the meeting wrapped up, people stayed behind, chatting and planning. The tension of the past few months seemed to lift like morning fog. Sarah gave me a tired smile. We actually did it, she said softly. For you, a free like is easy. But for me, it is the greatest support and encouragement. For this video, can you give me 1 like and 1 subscription? Thank you very much. I squeezed her hand. You did it? I just kept you supplied with coffee and sarcasm. She laughed, and for the first time since we moved in, it felt like the neighborhood belonged to us. The next morning, the news officially broke. Karen was being charged with fraud, theft by deception, harassment, and conspiracy. The local news even aired footage of the police carting off box after box from her house, her infamous binder among them. I couldn't help but smirk at the irony of that ugly thing being tagged as evidence. We spent the day fielding calls from reporters and neighbors alike, all wanting to know how we managed to topple Karen's little kingdom. Sarah kept it simple. We just wouldn't let her bully us, she said with a shrug. A week later, as we were out front planting new flowers, a project we'd been putting off during the chaos, a familiar car pulled up. Officer Price stepped out, giving us a respectful nod. Just wanted to let you know, he said, she's not coming back. They denied her bail. Too much evidence of her tampering with witnesses and threatening residents. She's going to face trial. Relief washed over me, and I couldn't help but grin. That's good to hear. Maybe people will finally get some peace. Price gave a half smile. People like you don't back down when you know you're right. You did good. As he drove off, I looked at Sarah, who was wiping dirt from her hands and smiling softly. We're staying, right? I asked, just to be sure. She glanced at the blooming tulips, the clear sky, and the neighbors chatting happily across the street. Yeah, she said, pulling off her gloves. We're staying. We finally made this place ours. Life after Karen's downfall felt like stepping out into fresh air after being stuck in a dusty, Claustrophobic attic. The neighborhood was buzzing with a cautious sense of freedom, like everyone was rediscovering how to breathe without looking over their shoulders. Sarah and I spent the next few days helping people compile their evidence, copies of fake fines, Karen's bogus citations, and written testimonies. The sheer volume of complaints was staggering. I couldn't believe how many people had been living under her thumb for so long. Brian took charge of organizing a formal community meeting, this time without Karen barking orders from the front. Sarah and I helped set up folding chairs in the park pavilion, and neighbors trickled in with snacks and drinks, actually smiling and greeting each other for once. It was the first time I'd seen people look genuinely relaxed instead of paranoid and guarded. Brian cleared his throat and addressed the group, his voice confident. "Folks, we did it. Karen's facing trial, and the police are handling the financial restitution process. But we need to talk about moving forward. We can't let fear control us anymore." A few murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Sarah raised her hand and stood up, and people fell silent out of sheer respect. "We've learned a lot from this," she said, looking around. "The most important lesson: don't hand over power without asking questions. Karen thrived because she made us feel powerless, like we couldn't push back. That stops now." The crowd erupted into applause, and I couldn't help but grin. Sarah, always the voice of reason and rebellion, had done more than just expose Karen. She'd inspired the whole neighborhood to take ownership of their lives again. After the meeting, people stayed behind, mingling and chatting. Someone set up a portable speaker, and music started playing. Kids were running around without their parents whispering anxiously to reel them back in. It was like a dark cloud had finally lifted. Brian wandered over, a grin plastered on his face. "You guys are officially legends," he joked. "Pretty sure there's talk of naming the next block party after you." Sarah just rolled her eyes and laughed. "Let's not get carried away. Just make sure no one tries to be the next self-appointed dictator." Brian nodded, his face more serious now. "That's not going to happen. People are awake now, thanks to you too." As the gathering wound down, I glanced across the street and saw a familiar figure standing on the edge of his yard, Rick. He looked hesitant, like a kicked dog unsure if it was safe to come back. Sarah nudged me, and we walked over. "Hey," I greeted, keeping my tone neutral. He looked up, guilt playing on his face. "Hey," he muttered back. "I just wanted to say sorry. I didn't know. I thought she was right about keeping things in order." Sarah gave him a measured look. "Fear makes people do stupid things. You weren't the only one who fell for it." Rick nodded slowly, like the weight of it all was finally sinking in. "If there's anything I can do to help clean up this mess, just let me know." I clapped him on the shoulder. "Just don't follow the next loudmouth who claims they're in charge," I joked. He managed a weak smile. That evening, as the sun dipped low and neighbors lingered in the fading light, Sarah and I finally sat on our porch swing, exhaustion and satisfaction mixing in equal parts. She leaned against me, and I wrapped my arm around her shoulders, letting the soft breeze carry away the last bits of tension. "We did good," I murmured. She smiled, tipping her head back to look up at the clear, star-speckled sky. "Yeah," she agreed. "We took back our peace." A few days later, I was watering the new flower beds when my phone buzzed with a news notification: "Local HOA scammer faces multiple charges." I skimmed the article, grinning at the thought of Karen trying to defend herself in court. The neighborhood had officially pressed charges, and the district attorney was pushing for maximum sentencing. As I tucked my phone away, Brian jogged by, giving me a quick wave. "Looks like we're hosting the block party at your place next month," he called out. I just laughed, shaking my head. "I'll break out the good beer," I shouted back. Sarah joined me on the porch, wiping dirt off her hands from planting new hydrangeas. "Everything all right?" she asked. I nodded, pulling her close. "Better than all right," I said. "For the first time since we moved in, it feels like home." She kissed my cheek and settled next to me, and we just sat there, listening to the peaceful hum of life going on without fear. After everything we'd been through, the simple quiet was worth more than any victory parade. We didn't just reclaim our neighborhood, we reclaimed our lives.